Morning, we're looking at someone in Baptist history, and this is our 35th Baptist, and I think everybody should know. And this morning I want to talk about a man whose ministry was almost entirely in the state of Texas, but John Norris was born in Alabama of 1877. He moved to Texas very early. He was born into a drunkard's home, and I think it seems that a lot of the kids were relentless in teasing him and really, just berating him because of his father. His mother said to him one day, she said, "One day we're going to wear nice clothes, John, and one day God is going to use you in a great way." His dad would beat him, and one time he beat him almost to death. They didn't know if he was going to live or not. As a boy, he did. He was saved as a young man. The reason I tell you about his living in that home is because it's probably formed what will become his personality. And we're going to learn about the man in just a minute, but it probably goes back to some of these early days and how his father treated him. But he was saved early, and in 1903 he graduated from Baylor University, the Southern Baptist University, with highest honors. He then attended seminary and graduated valedictorian. And this man would become known as the fighting fundamentalist, and a lot have used that term. We use the term here, but this is the original fighting fundamentalist, and this is the man that is called the fighting fundamentalist, earned that name first. And he fought the liquor industry, he fought gambling, he fought modernism. At the time, basically modernism is the liberal theologians of the day that were coming into the Baptist churches and colleges. He railed on the Southern Baptists because of the inroads that liberalism was making in their churches, eventually leaving that movement. And we know this man as J. Frank Norris. Is the man we know. After graduating from seminary, he became pastor of the First Baptist Church of Fort Worth, Texas in 1909. In 1924, and he built that church. In 1924, he hired a man from the railroad industry, a layman, and asked him to come into full-time service and join him there in Fort Worth. And the man's name was Beecham Vick. And Beecham Vick worked on his staff, and really Beecham Vick ran the Sunday school in his church, and he would build that Sunday school into the largest Sunday school in the world. For 40 years, he was pastor of First Baptist Fort Worth. He built that church, then God blessed, and that church became the largest church in America in Fort Worth there. It was at the dedication of the First Baptist new auditorium 10 years into his pastorate in 1919, the Fort Worth Record, the newspaper reported total attendance for the day was more than 12,000, with at least 2,000 turned away. 200 people were saved and added to the church that day. And just an amazing ministry there in Fort Worth, Texas. He was also instrumental in bringing the small Bible department at Baylor University. He wanted to make it a full-fledged seminary, and he brought that to Fort Worth. And you see a picture there of the massive amounts of students in that seminary. It would eventually become the largest seminary in the world, and that would take a couple different name changes, but became very large. In 1934, interestingly enough, a church in Detroit, Michigan, called him to be their pastor. And of course, he was already pastor of the church in Fort Worth, and he prayed about it and felt that God would have him pastor also at the same time the church in Detroit, Michigan. And so he became pastor of Temple Baptist Church in Detroit. This is an amazing moment in American history as this man pastored the two largest churches in America at the same time. Just a really very interesting moment. And many times he was quite the, showman. Many times he wouldn't announce where he was going to be and which church he was going to be at. Kept people guessing. And he would make that trip back and forth, that 1,300 miles back and forth, preaching there. Eventually he would ask Beecham Vick, his loyal lieutenant there in Fort Worth, who had done such great work there in the Sunday school movement, to move to Detroit and really be the day-to-day assistant there in Detroit. Vick did that, and really it's Vick that did an amazing work there in Detroit also. So Norris pastored both churches at the same time, heavily relying on Vick in Detroit. He was a great writer. He took over the leadership of the Baptist Standard, which was a Southern Baptist newspaper, and his name became almost a household word across America because of the influence of his writings. He authored The Searchlight, The Fundamentalists later, and he used the fundamentalists. This is when he really went after the Southern Baptist Convention and started exposing their fallacies. He put the issues in print, and he named names. And he fought the modernism that was sweeping and creeping into the Baptist churches, and especially Southern Baptist Convention. I won't go into modernism, but basically it's a German rationalism that had swept Europe and was coming into the American churches. It's a huge movement across the world at that time. World War I kind of dampened the promise that the modernists made, but it continued to take over the institutions of higher learning. And of course, we're reaping those benefits today. Those not really benefits, but we're reaping that today for what it did to the universities, and especially the Christian universities. So this was the reason for him writing in The Fundamentalist. This is about the time that the fundamentals were written to stop the growth and to teach people what was going on in the modernistic movement, as we've talked about the fundamentals and what that meant to Christians. So he was quite a crusader for the right and for fundamentalism, both with his pen and his voice. At one point, Baylor University began teaching evolution in their classes. I don't know if that really shocks you, but that's just shocking, really, that in the main Southern Baptist school, evolution starts to be taught. And this is the early 20th century, and it's just unheard of. And of course, he would rail against the Southern Baptists for that. He eventually was kicked out of the movement in 1924, and he began his own World Baptist Fellowship as a fundamental version of the Southern Baptist Convention. He was contemporaries, you might remember last week's man, with George Truett. George Truett is in Dallas, and Norris is in Fort Worth. If you think about it, we hear those terms, and Dallas, Fort Worth, it's kind of one large city now. They've grown together. So here's these two great Baptist pastors building these large churches and large movements next door to each other. But what's interesting is that the men didn't like each other, and their whole ministry they fought. And I think that the reason that Norris, if we can understand, it's very complicated, but if you can understand, Norris is fighting against the Southern Baptist Convention, and Truett felt, I guess, he was reluctant to leave the movement because he felt he could change it from the inside. And we see that over and over in history, where good men, stay initially in the church that they're in or the movement they're in, trying to change the movement from the inside. We saw that in the Congregationalist movement in early America, even with Martin Luther, 500 years ago, initially trying to change the church from the inside and then realizing it's not the Catholic Church not worth it or can't do it. But so these two men fought their entire lives. Isn't it interesting? Just these two great men of God that really, really didn't like each other and fought. So anyway, Norris, though, very big believer in door-to-door soul winning organization, literally tens of thousands of people saved under his ministry. He would preach very sensational topics. He would announce his sermon titles the week before, really just to try to get the local area talking about the sermons, and people would come just out of interest to see what in the world that title meant and what was he going to preach about today. One Sunday morning, and this is, I guess, not really humorous, but kind of humorous, but the subject is not humorous, but he announced that he was going to expose, on Sunday morning, he announced that evening he was going to expose a man in the church who was having an adulterous affair. He said he was going to name him, he's going to name his name. He said his wife doesn't even know about the affair. That afternoon, 13 men came to his office and said, "Please don't put my family through this." Confessed their sins to the Lord and got right with the Lord. Just an amazing, that's the kind of man he was. And I think he didn't know that was going to happen, but that's the kind of thing he would build enormous loyalty around him. In fact, he would be what we would call the first maybe pastor that at this time that would cultivate the cult of personality, and just was very loyal to those that were loyal to him, but very mean and mean-spirited to those that would disagree with him and fight him. We'll see later, I think we see even like Jack Hyles take that to a whole different level. Men in our modern movement, that cult of the personality. But he was probably the first to do that and really built a very loyal people around him. He was very impatient, and I'm kind of giving you some of the negatives from his ministry. I think we should see kind of what, this man was not perfect. He was a very imperfect man, but he, as I said, he was very mean-spirited, almost hateful to anyone who didn't agree with him. And man, would he fight. And I think as having to fight as a boy for his family, and that kind of led to this. And I have to say that he fought maybe to a fault, almost maybe harming his testimony along the way. He fought these people who didn't like him. Like he would fight, as I said, George Truett, a great man of God, and he would fight him. But he loved controversy. One biographer named his book God's Rascal in describing this man. He was called the Texas Tornado. And the stories are perhaps exaggerated, but they're amazing to read. This story is true. He actually shot a man and killed a man inside his office one day, and there in Fort Worth. A Catholic man who hated Norris came to church one day to confront him. The man had a history of hatred and slander, public slander toward him. Pastor went to trial. Of course, he's the only one that lived to tell the story. And he said it was self-defense as the man went for his gun. He had a gun on his desk, and he shot him. He was fully vindicated, and the courts, as I said, vindicating. But as you can imagine, he never really fully recovered from that incident, as you wouldn't. But in a way, he became America's pastor. He advised Franklin Roosevelt through World War II. He advised Churchill. He advised Truman on the Jewish problems, the Jewish state in the late 40s. And eventually, he would drive Beecham Vick away from him. Beecham Vick, his very loyal assistant, who was, again, building the church in Detroit, had built the Sunday school there, the largest Sunday school in the world in Fort Worth. And he would split, Vick and Norris would split, and we'll talk about that next week. But it's because of that split that Norris began what really is what we know now as the Independent Baptist movement. I guess we could say we can thank J. Frank Norris for the movement that we would, in a sense, be not involved, loosely involved in, but the Independent Baptist movement really comes from that split, because Vic went off and started the Baptist Bible Fellowship, and of course the Southern Baptist Convention did what it did, and Norris just began an independent church, and really the independent churches come from that split. He really gave us a Sunday school movement as we know today, and we can really thank him for what would become our Independent Baptist movement. And J. Frank Norris, the Texas Tornado, died in 1952 while preaching in a youth camp in Florida. And this morning, a very unusual man, but a true man of God, and I want to thank the Lord for this man and how God used him.